I know, you never know.
I don't know what time voting starts, but I heard that New Hampshire had voted. A village in New Hampshire had already voted.
I think it starts at 6:30 or something like that in the morning.
Wow.
Yes.
Yes, I
Voting.
think so.
Hello, Rashid.
Hello, Masood.
Hi, Hannah.
Okay, we can
Hi, Masood.
start in a few minutes. Is that all right with everybody?
Oh, absolutely.
Please go ahead.
Let me know whenever you want me to start.
Okay, 2 minutes to go.
Okay, great. And Hannah's kindly agreed to help with putting up some of the slides, so she'll share a screen in due course.
So what I'll do is I'll make a co-host.
You must.
So I made Miss Hannah Brown our co-host.
Thank you.
Great.
I should have known, Rashid, that you would have had your tie on. I should have put my tie on.
No, I actually, no, everybody's quite relaxed.
I see Shahid sitting there in the back.
Shahid is here. Okay, we can start now.
Yes, please, sir.
Dr. Shahid Amjad Chaudhry, Rector, Lahore School of Economics, distinguished participants, professors and students. It is really my pleasure to welcome Mr. Masood Ahmed back to the Lahore School. He's been there a few times, but this time it is online. Just a few words to say, he's the president of the Center for Global Development in Washington, a very well-known think tank. He has been former director in the IMF for Middle East and Central Asia, which includes Pakistan, and actually was the director which negotiated with the Pakistan government the IMF program for 2013, which was one of the only program or one of the very few programs which actually lasted. Well, Mr. Masood Ahmed is of Pakistani origin and is one of our well-known and distinguished economists which Pakistan is proud to have produced. He is a graduate and postgraduate from the London School of Economics, where he also taught briefly on the faculty. He has a distinguished career. He has been a vice president of the World Bank, where he served for many years, including heading its network on poverty. He was the Director General of DFID in the UK, which is the main aid agency. And till recently, or 2 years ago, he was the director at the International Monetary Fund. He's going to speak to us on Pakistan's stabilization and growth, a delicate balance, where I'm sure he will be drawing on his experience with Pakistan and the IMF. Masood Ahmed Saab, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Rashid. I hope you and everyone can hear me clearly. And I want to start off by thanking you for this opportunity. As you said, I've had the privilege of coming and talking with some of your colleagues and students in person earlier. And now, like so much of life, we are getting used to doing this remotely. I do hope that we'll be able to get to a point where I can resume an in-person conversation as well in the future. So look forward to that. I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationships as we see them between stabilization programs and growth. And I'll come to Pakistan, but I want to look at it also a bit more broadly in terms of the global experience, working with IMF programs in particular. Because I think one of the questions that we always have about IMF programs in each country is, are they actually slowing down growth? Are they bad for growth in the near term, but also in the longer term? And what can we say about that? I want to start by just giving you quickly, if you look at the outline of what I'm going to talk about, Hannah, if you could move to the next slide. So here you have, I want to say a little bit about the current situation first. It's very hard to talk about any program without thinking about how our whole approach to a macro has been a bit upended by what's going on in the world now in terms of the response to the crisis. Then I want to come back to what is the core of what I want to talk about, which is sort of stabilization and growth relationships in the context of IMF programs. And then maybe just say a word to trigger a conversation on what we think are the true drivers of growth. Come to that. Now, if you look at the stabilization programs, we've more or less intuitively think about stabilization as happening when economies overheat. So it sort of happens after things become unstable in terms of overheating or having unsustainable deficits. But right now, what you're looking at in the world is really a flip side of that, which is a global effort to try and stabilize economies from collapsing. And this is not something that we've had to see in many countries for many decades. But if you look at the magnitude of the stabilization effort that is now underway to prevent global economic collapse, it really is extraordinary. This is the largest response to COVID that in terms of macroeconomic policy in the rich countries that has ever been seen. And in terms of reviving aggregate demand in the rich countries, they've undertaken a fiscal stimulus of about 12 trillion. They've then also added on to it monetary policy, which has been very accommodative and trying to provide all manner of liquidity to the economy. And what is perhaps most striking is the difference in the ability of rich countries and not so rich countries to respond to this collapse in demand that has come about and the supply shock that has come from COVID. Hannah, if you could move to the next slide, please. And what you see is that, as I said, in the rich countries, you have about 20% of GDP has been the size, the average size of the fiscal response to COVID. In the emerging markets, it's about 6% of GDP. And in the poorest countries, the low-income countries, it's about 2% of GDP. So all these countries hit by the same global shock. And if you think about it in a single sentence, it's sort of like the rich countries have taken the approach of do what you need to do, spend what you have to spend to counter this. And the poor countries have been in a position where they're doing what they can with very limited means. And this is a separate conversation, but it's worth just saying that I think that I've never seen in my time as a professional working on international economics such an extraordinary diversity or difference, contrast between the size, speed, and scope of the response to a crisis domestically compared with the woefully inadequate international response that we have seen so far in terms of helping countries who don't have the pockets or to be able to draw on their own resources to combat the shock, and who have not been able to access financial markets to be able to do that. And we can talk, if you are interested, in what that implies going forward. But let's turn now to, and I just want to show you one slide, which is sort of a little bit last week. I don't know, some of you saw the headlines in the Financial Times, which declared the week of the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank, which was 3 weeks ago, that this was the end of austerity now. But of course, I was having a conversation with the managing director of the IMF last Friday. On our website, you can see it. And one of the things we were discussing was that that's fine if you can afford it. But if you don't have the resources to send someone a message saying, don't worry about austerity, spend, is not very meaningful if they don't actually have the resources to be able to combat the crisis. Let's now turn to what I think we think of as economic stabilization programs, which is sort of in the opposite sense. These are programs that come in when economies have become overheated, or they end up with unsustainable balances. And what you see traditionally, the design of these programs is to try and restore stability, by focusing on the deficits, mostly the current account and fiscal deficit, and building up foreign exchange reserves. So that's what they're trying to sort out in the near term. And there are fairly standard ways in which they go about doing it. I don't need to spend time on them. They try to change relative prices by focusing on the exchange rates, and with the hope that this will increase exports with a lag and reduce imports more quickly. And they try and reduce aggregate demand by working on the macro, on the fiscal and the monetary side. And then the idea is that you slow the economy down and you create conditions for resuming a more sustainable growth path. So I guess the first point that's really important for me is that slowing the economy down, at least in the near term, is built into the design of most of these adjustment programs, stabilization programs. Then the other thing is, okay, that's the design, but in practice, how do these programs actually work out? Because the idea is that you slow the economy down, but then in 2 or 3 years, having created this condition for a more sustainable growth and fix some of the imbalances, the structural problems, you should see a resumption of growth and living standards improving in a more sustainable way. Does that actually happen? So when looked at IMF programs, and I think to give the IMF credit, they actually went and did a review of all their programs and tried to see what the outcomes were. And this is available on the IMF website. There's a reference at the bottom. So anybody who's interested can get many more details. But the sort of summary version of it is that by and large, these programs do fine in terms of achieving the immediate objective of improving the current account. More often than not, actually, if you look at the size of the green bars on the right, those are the bars that reflect the percentage of programs that they reviewed where the outcomes in terms of improving the current account were actually better than they had forecasted at the beginning of the program. In some cases, by quite significantly better, as you can see, significant number where the outcomes were worse, but on balance, on current account, the programs tend to achieve what they set out to do. Then if you look at how do they do that? Well, I think the thing that happens is that more often than not, it's the import compression which manages to improve the current account. So remember, the initial idea was that you sort of see an improvement coming in the near term through imports, and then exports are beginning to pick up. Well, 3 years after you start, still really, imports are driving a lot of this. Now, as you can see, you sort of evenly spread. There's no systematic bias. I don't think that if looking at this chart, you would say that everything is grouped in the center, which is what you would expect if the projections were very accurate or turn out to be very accurate. But you can't see a systematic bias in terms of saying that programs do worse in one direction or the other. If anything, I would say a little bit more import compression. Now, if you look again at foreign exchange reserves, again, by and large, they come out sort of all over the place, but no systematic bias on reserves across all of the fund programs. So on all of these things that are related to the current account, programs tend to have an outcome which isn't always sort of, or even often, very close to what was projected, but there's no systematic bias. Now, where you do see a systematic one-sided outcome, and therefore the projections that were made at the beginning of the program turn out to be systematically optimistic, is on growth. So if you look at all the IMF programs, 3 years after the start of the program, growth is worse than was projected in many, many more cases than those where growth outcomes turn out to be better. So I think the one important message from this exercise for me when I reviewed it was that while the IMF programs do more or less as they'd anticipated on fixing the current account, there is a problem with the way in which they expect growth to turn around in at least 3 years. And this is only looking 3 years, but 3 years is a reasonable time compared with what happens. Now, you might then say, well, why does this happen? What's the explanation? Why does growth underperform? And you could think of 3 reasons. One is that actually the fiscal and monetary measures that they bring to stabilize the economy turn out to have a bigger downside impact on growth than they anticipate. So they might have thought that if you cut back the deficit by 2%, that's going to have a certain consequence for growth. Well, actually, it turns out that the consequence is great. Similarly, when you make credit tighter, more difficult to obtain, more expensive, that has a consequence on private sector-led growth that is worse than you think. The second reason is that maybe they overestimate the growth impact that will come about from the structural measures that are in the program. So part of the storyline of these programs is that, the macro is fixed near term through these macro measures, and then you have structural measures that you put in, and by these structural reforms will unleash, the growth potential. And maybe the result from looking at the outcomes is that these structural measures aren't quite as growth enhancing as they are expected to be in the design of the program, or maybe they're just not implemented. So you could argue that actually the measures would have been effective, but in practice they weren't done. So it's useful to drill down a little bit into this. So let's just take a minute on each of these. And if you look at the fiscal multiplier, I think it was in the European crisis, if you remember that time, now almost 10 years ago or a little over, where it became very clear that the fund had underestimated the impact of fiscal contraction. And I think what became clear then in the work that Olivier Blanchard and others in the research department of the IMF did, that our understanding of fiscal multipliers didn't take enough account at that time, and I say our because at that time I was in the fund, didn't take enough account of variations across countries and also over time. So at that time in Europe, there was a, because other countries were also in a similar downward pressure, the impact of the fiscal contraction in the fund supported programs turned out to be greater on growth. Then there's a lot of work that's been done on trying to look at the structure of where and how you bring about fiscal adjustment, whether that has an impact. I think there's also quite a lot of discussion, including in Pakistan, about what the consequences of monetary policy are in a country where the government deficit is the big demand side of for loans from the banking sector, and so and it's a little less sensitive to interest rate policy, so you end up having to raise interest rates quite a lot, and then you end up having a big impact on the private sector. So one set of issues is really around fiscal and monetary. The second set of questions is, well, what about these structural reforms? And one thing that kind of, I hadn't really focused enough on this until I looked at the results across all the programs, is we tend to think of structural reforms as being all over the place in a fund program. You sort of think, well, they cover a whole range of things. I mean, the basic theory is fairly straightforward, essentially that you focus on the kinds of impediments in the institution, regulatory structure that's not allowing the economy to deliver and to operate in its full potential. And if you help address and remove some of these constraints, then you sort of open up the space in which the economic actors can act, and you'll see a speeding up of growth. And now, if you look at where these structural reforms in practice fall in terms of the nature of the economy, what you'll see is that in that next slide is that the majority of the reforms actually are very close to the core areas of macro. So Hannah, if you could put the next slide up, please. What you'll see, in fact, is that the structural conditions that are in fund programs, more than half of them are really around sort of fiscal, public financial management, resource allocation. So in the case of Pakistan also, for example, if you look at programs, a lot of them have focused around the tax system, tax administration. And then there's a set of things that are, if you look at the other big areas, it's sort of central bank, and generally it's around central bank autonomy, central bank independence, those kinds of things that will be in many fund programs. There's a set of issues around financial sector reforms, and often there's a set of issues around public enterprise reform. So, which is where you'll find there's generally a macro link that comes from these public enterprise. So actually, I was a little bit, this was interesting for me because I had, my prior going into this was that I would have found the structural conditions more spread around different areas of the economy. But this sort of shows that at least over the last few years, fund programs have tended to become more focused on their core business, which I think is actually a good thing, because I do remember in my very early days, I did the fund in 2002, I did a review of conditionality for the fund. Well, one of the predecessors, but many of this review. That was my first task there. And one of the things we discovered at the time was that the fund's conditionality had strayed into all manner of areas in which the IMF had very little expertise. And the reason it had strayed there was because other agencies, notably the World Bank, were very keen to use IMF programs as a way of trying to get governments to take action on things that they themselves felt were useful, but which they hadn't been able to adequately convince the governments to do. So they sort of put them on the back of IMF programs. And at that time, the IMF was very happy to take on board other people's water. And I think it just made for a little bit of a mess. So they learned a lesson from that, I think, in the last few years. Now, do these programs actually get implemented? Well, the answer seems to be it's pretty mixed. About half of the programs, and actually not a little over half the programs, get implemented on time. And a significant number, actually a larger number than was the case a decade ago, tend to go off track. So if you look at this, it's not so obvious to be able to say, was the disappointing outcomes on growth a function of not getting the design right, or was it because the programs were not implemented? And there's also one line of argument, which I don't think you can discount, which says that if you systematically can't get something implemented, that is a design problem. It's not an implementation problem. If you can't get anything, if you find that repeatedly you can't get something done right, maybe the way you're trying to do it is a problem. So that's something to remember. Now, just a couple of slides, 3 or 4 slides on Pakistan that I want to show you before we open it up. So if you look at programs in Pakistan and see what happens in the near term, what's the immediate impact of these programs? Well, they're pretty consistent, I would say, with the exception of 2013-14 period. But the other two, the 2008, 9, and then the current program, what you really see is a very quick improvement in the current account, resulting pretty much exclusively from a big compression in exports. So you cut back on exports, in part because of aggregate demand, in part because of prices, because you've got exchange rates. And you see the improvement coming about in the current account. Sorry, did I say exports? I misspoke. I meant imports, obviously. So this is all basically being driven by imports. What I meant to say was that exports in both cases, in one case they go marginally, in the other case actually go down. I think this is essentially a story that the near-term effect is basically an import compression-driven current account improvement. Now, if you look at a couple more slides I want to show you, the next one basically says, well, what happened 3 years out? Remember, we were looking at the aggregate programs of the IMF 3 years out on outcomes. And if you look at the 2000, so you've got sort of the 3 programs. The third one, obviously, we can't say what is going to be 3 years out, but the current program. But what we can say is how have the projections been revised in the first year because of the impact of COVID? And I'll come to that in a minute. But essentially, what you see is that the actual outcomes in terms of current account deficit, and growth, 2008-9, 3 years out, more or less similar picture to what you had seen in the near term, with the exception that export performance really has been systematically much worse than expected in both previous programs. And the interesting thing in terms of looking at the current program is that you see, as a result of the discussions that the fund and the Pakistani authorities have been having, that in their most recent public projections, they have revised down the expectations for growth and a little bit of exports. Although personally, I'm still of the view that even those export numbers are a little optimistic. And they have revised to a larger current account deficit 3 years from now. Now, if you look at the next slide, this is also quite interesting to see, well, how have they reflected the impact of COVID in terms of the projections for the fiscal and the debt? And I think one can argue about whether there's enough of an adjustment or too much of an adjustment, but essentially the picture here is that in both cases, they sort of see by fiscal 22, maybe it'll be fiscal 23, things coming back to the old path. But between now and then, you see a different trajectory than the one that had been anticipated before COVID. I guess the interesting question will be a year from now whether that thing gets pushed out a bit more, which we can talk about. Now, I just want to finish up with a couple more slides. And I want to look at this. This is quite an interesting slide for me. If you look at this over a long period, and all of you know the Pakistani economy better than I do, but I mean, the thing that strikes me here is that essentially what you've got is on the external side, no real meaningful improvement in export performance over this period of 15 years, with remittances going up and essentially financing between them this big increase in imports. Now, the other thing that is interesting to look at when you look at the history of programs in Pakistan, and that's on the next slide, is that this is the sort of peaks and valleys pattern of foreign exchange reserves in Pakistan is striking for two reasons. One is kind of the peaks and valleys are actually pretty far apart compared to most countries. And the second is that there's quite a regularity to them. It's sort of you sort of see this pattern repeat itself every few years. And the other thing that is interesting is that and this is a point that I'm still struggling to understand the rationale for, but under the IMF, during the period when there's an IMF program, the real exchange rate actually appreciates. And it's sort of interesting. It was most apparent and during the last program, and you remember that was the reason by the time it ended, you ended up with a much bigger current account, a deficit that had been projected, and exports weren't doing well. And I was at that time a little bit involved in that program, and I remember some conversations where there was a sort of difference of view, shall we say, in terms of the relationship between exchange rates and export performance across the two sides of the table. But this is an interesting pattern. And the last thing I wanted to show is a slide that actually Reza Bakr used when he did a presentation recently on Pakistan's performance in COVID, which was quite interesting. And there are many more details in his presentation. So anyone who's interested can go onto the CGD website and take a look at that. But this is one slide. And the basic point he was making was that they had, since the middle of last year, when they started the IMF program, um, built up a lot of foreign exchange reserve buffers. And as a result, when Pakistan got hit by the pandemic and then by the economic consequences of that pandemic, Pakistan was in a much better place to be able to draw down on some of those reserves that they had built up in the previous 8 or 10 months than would have been the case if the pandemic had struck, let's say, 6 months earlier. And I was a bit, I thought that was something that was worth noting, that unlike many countries, in this case, I mean, you can't say through any anticipation of what was to come, but that particular strategy seems to have paid off and helped Pakistan in being able to deal with the pandemic. So let me end. Bottom line, I would say is, if you look at stabilization programs supported by the IMF, they tend to do their immediate task of inducing stabilization, but they pretty systematically overestimate growth outcomes. And not obvious why this is the case, but it's certainly the case that the implementation of the reforms that are supposed to unleash growth is pretty patchy. And also that it's not clear how much those reforms, even if they had been implemented, would have actually brought about the improvement in growth. And so I think that's really a conversation that brings us back to, what do we understand about what will trigger a change in growth? And here, let me just end by saying that growth in the post-COVID economy may come about in very different ways than growth which we thought about as sort of sensible paths to growth prior to COVID, for a whole variety of reasons, including global supply chains and the like, but which we can talk about, and also because of an increasing geopolitical polarization and almost a sort of parallel economies being parallel circles or spheres of influence, economic influence being created now with what I think is fair to call a sort of increasingly adversarial relationship between the US and China, rather than one simply of competitors. How that will affect emerging markets is also an issue going forward. So let me end with that and look forward to any comments or questions that you or colleagues might have.
Well, thank you very much, Masood, for a very interesting and in-depth analysis of stabilization programs and showing how their impact has been, and especially on questions of design of programs, the timeframes, all of which is interesting. And in the end, on that note, which that gives us, for the first time, we have gone into a crisis with slightly better reserves than we have in the past, is at least a positive kind of a view. So I will open the thing for discussion and for questions, really. We have about 15, 20 minutes. Masood has, in fact, stuck to his time precisely. He was given 35 minutes, and I must say you did take 35 minutes. So let me start by asking one of our students whether they would like to ask a question. And if they are still thinking of a question, we can ask the professors and teachers and others who are here. So who would like to go first from amongst any of our students who would like to ask a question?
May I ask a question, sir?
Yes, please go ahead. Ms. Zara Maurice is an MPhil Development Studies student. Please go ahead.
Um, so as we talk about the projections that IMF has made for Pakistan in the post-COVID situation in the next 1 year or so, the growth projections and for employment as well have, been drastically been driven down, and logically so. But the IMF is adamant that the conditions that were agreed upon for its 22nd program for Pakistan be kept as they were. They are not revising the targets, given the situation that we are in, expecting taxes to be increased and the prices to be increased for necessary items. Why does IMF not consider the fact that Pakistan, a relatively poor country or a poor country itself, that has shown a considerably better response to COVID-19's economic crisis, cannot practically manage those targets that are being set by IMF? And then we talk about the fundamental issue with the growth targets or whatever policies the SAPs bring to us. Probably the impractical scenario is there, isn't it?
Thank you, Zara. Masood, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. So, Zara, I'm glad that you raised that. So I mean, I don't want to speak for the IMF, and I don't know exactly where the conversation is between them. But I would say that there are two kinds of targets. So one would be pure macro targets on fiscal, for example, on taxes, on primary deficit. And there, I would be surprised. I mean, maybe it's the case, as I say, you may know more about it than I do, but I would be surprised if they are looking for the same numbers. Because you remember that slide that I put up 2 slides ago? The numbers that they had for fiscal deficit for 2020, 21 were a much larger fiscal deficit than they were showing before, and similarly on debt. So I had understood from the fact that they had put these numbers out in the public domain that this is the new target that they are discussing. So my guess is, and if they aren't, I think it's not a sensible strategy, but I would be surprised that they're going to be trying to stick to some macro targets, which clearly are no longer feasible. It doesn't make any sense. Now, there's another set of targets where I think this is a good moment for a country like Pakistan to be able to move forward. It's very hard right now to move on things which affect ordinary people. If you raise electricity prices, it's very hard right now. People are already suffering from COVID and from the lockdown to be able to pay for that. But there's a set of what are called structural measures, where the main opposition to them in countries, including in Pakistan, has come not from ordinary people, but from the few people who actually benefit from those distortions, because the distortions sometimes created actually to help particular groups of people. And actually sometimes, I mean, from my own history of looking at programs in countries, including Pakistan, sometimes not that many people, very few people benefit from a particular government policy because it's sort of designed that way. And I think this is a good time to be able to move on those, because my guess is that actually those measures demonstrate a willingness to take action. And a lot of public opinion in many countries would actually support that, because they see this as a time when everybody should be paying a fair price. Now, the most difficult question is in countries where there is a perception that taxes are not being paid by people who can afford to, and who are the sort of better off rich people in societies don't pay their fair share. And that's something that many exists in many countries, that problem. The IMF the World Bank, other donors all get very worked up about it because I remember once the minister came from the UK to Pakistan, and I remember her saying, why should our taxpayers pay if your own rich potential taxpayers are not paying? And that's the sort of people think like that in donor countries. What I think makes it a bit harder to implement is that when they push very hard to raise taxes, often the easiest taxes to raise are ones that actually end up affecting ordinary people more. So, the focus on the aggregate tax to GDP ratio sometimes hides a lot of problems underneath.
Thank you very much, Masood. I think, can I take one more question from any of the students who would like to ask a question? Okay, then Javed Malik Saab, would you like to ask a question, Javed?
All right. I think I'll follow up on Zara's question, but in more general terms. And it's on the rigidity of the IMF and the IMF programs. Now, whether the fund-supported programs will go off track, as I've seen, depends a lot on domestic factors, on domestic circumstances that may promote opposition or unrest, and that is really not under the fund's control, and really the program design can't do much. So I would be interested in examples of where the IMF has kept this in mind and responded in some sort of adapted manner to this implementation challenge.
Masood, please go ahead.
So I think, Javed Saab, what I would say is that when I looked at fund programs, when I was working in the IMF, for example, more often than not, I would get criticized for changing the program design during implementation too easily and giving and supporting too many waivers. Waivers are when the condition is not met and the fund still goes ahead and provides funding. And if you remember in the 2013-16 program in Pakistan, a lot of the commentary was that the IMF was too accommodating in changing program design. So there's a question of balance. What I'm trying to say is that sometimes the criticism is that the IMF is too stuck on not recognizing the reality and unwilling to change. And sometimes the criticism is that it's too willing to change. And a lot of it depends on who you're talking to. So whenever I would go to a country, people in the government would generally say you're being too rigid. And all the people outside the government, and I would always make a point of meeting people outside government as well, and the independent economists would say, you're really being too accommodating and you're creating a problem for later for us. So I think the basic point that I want to say is that it's a question of getting the balance right. Now, does the IMF get the balance right all the time? I doubt it. I mean, I think, do they try to get the balance right? Yes. I mean, I certainly never came across an example where the IMF was sitting there thinking we're going to go out of our way to get this to be too rigid or not rigid. Now, where I think it becomes most difficult is where the governments themselves don't have a clear plan. What I found quite interesting, and this is general advice I've always given to people who come to me to say, well, what do you think should be our approach to dealing with the IMF? My basic message is have a strategy and a plan. If you only negotiate by saying we can't do this and we can't do that, this is too hard and that is too difficult, that's not a strategy. You have to say, this is what is our agenda, and you have to have a credible story of what you want to do is likely to result in what you want to achieve. If you, and I think most times the IMF actually is desperate to get a plan that they feel the country owns and wants to move with, because it's more likely that it will get implemented. I mean, they're most interested in getting a successful outcome. It's where there is a weak or incoherent strategy on the part of the country that you end up with these hastily cobbled together measures at the last minute, because you have to put things in there and nobody really has great faith that they are going to be implemented. Then sometimes you end up getting too stuck on things that don't make sense, and sometimes you end up being too accommodating. I remember, I mean, I'll say this because Shahid is sitting there, but Shahid will recall that, when for a period during the caretaker government, he was responsible for finance. And Shahid, you'll remember you came to the IMF and you came to visit, and we had a very nice conversation where it was very clear that you had a very clear strategy, and it made the conversations that the technical staff then had much easier, both because both sides understood what the plan was, and were able to then work within it. So I think that makes a big difference.
I may just add here, Masood, I think you are so far, most of the questions have been directed at you in terms of your previous hat you used to wear, which was the IMF. And I know you've been involved, but it would be always so very helpful to us that you are sitting in a leading development think tank in the US and deals with development. So it would also be useful for us to know from your, as being president of it. I mean, under the current COVID-19 circumstances, where it is very difficult to come up with a strategy or plan, or at least you can try to forecast something if you are brave enough to do so. So what is the current thinking? But you can say that in your closing comments if you wish. But would anybody else like to ask a question?
I'd like to ask something.
Please.
First, to Masood, I thank you for this great presentation. And I learned a lot. I think your analysis was quite interesting. I would have frankly gone further than your comments and said that if the whole success of the program depends on import compression, there are other ways of achieving import compression. I think the problem is you still want to have a market-determined exchange rate. And one question to Masood is, I don't know about this current program, is that does the fund actually have targets for countries like Pakistan? That, for instance, did they tell us to go from 90 or 100 or whatever to 170, where we overshot the real exchange rate by 30%? And why didn't they just get it right? Why don't you, as a matter of policy, say, well, adjust close to the, maintain the real exchange rate and and allow some import compression through other methods, like, for instance, tariffs and that sort of. I know this is an ideological issue and stuff. The second question I really have is that Pakistan is caught in a terrible debt trap. Pervez Hassan identified it even in 2000, but it's become worse. Our debt servicing is what, 10 billion a year, out of which more than half is to the fund, the World Bank and the Asian Bank. And therefore, what is effectively happening is that we actually have no degrees of freedom. If the fund drops its program, at the moment it's suspended it, then the IMF, the World Bank and the Asian Bank stop lending, cash lending, and then we go into a huge balance of payments crisis, because the only alternative is default. So, maybe the answer is, well, you asked for it and you got it, sort of thing. But what would you recommend in a situation like that for countries like Pakistan, where we really don't seem to have any option other than being driven and I personally, by the way, I don't think that the IMF is to blame. I think you put your finger on it very well. I think that the IMF, I found, maybe it was just you, but I do think that if the IMF is going back to basics, then I think, we can negotiate with the IMF. The problem is that institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Bank are so rigid on, for instance, insisting on various things that they're effectively driving the program, and in some sense using the fund as a cover. So, what options do countries like Pakistan have in a situation like that? Do we have any options or not?
Now, big question that we're running out of time. So I'll give you a sort of 2-minute version, and then we should actually continue this conversation. I'd be very happy to do that at another point also. Look, I think the fundamental problem and the debt problem you've identified is very real. If you look at our long-term picture, if we want to raise living standards and be able to finance the kinds of imports that we need, both for consumption and for investment, we have to be able to do that on a sustainable basis. And our basic strategy has been, look at our export performance over 30 years, not just volumes, but composition, value added. We've really relied on borrowing, official and unofficial, and remittances to finance a consumption type economy. And that's, ultimately leaves us very vulnerable. Every few years, we either overborrow or we get a shock. Then we go through these peaks and valleys. And the net result is that we are just not able to get out of that equilibrium, which is a trap in a way, to a different equilibrium. So I would say, I think our strategy is not one that's going to be solved in the near term. It's not a sort of quick fix. It's actually changing the structure of the economy. How we go about doing that is a sort of detailed and serious, complex conversation that one needs to have. But I would say near-term thinking in many countries is that the debt problems are going to be a big impediment for the next 2 or 3 years. Probably 20, 30 countries are going to find that their debts have become unpayable, unsustainable. And most of them don't have market access, so it's easy to deal with their debt problems without having to bring private creditors into it. Those that have private market access are very reluctant to have debt restructuring because they're afraid that this would put them out of the financial markets for many years to come. And I think for the next year, one of the big challenges, we're having elections here today in the US, so we'll see what the outcome is. But a big challenge for the international financial system will be to find a way out of this unsustainable debt, including, but not only including debt from China, and doing it in a way that is cooperative, which brings China into the package. So I want to thank you for giving me this chance, Rashid, and thanks all of you for participating as well. And as I said, there's many things we could be discussing, and it would be a privilege for me to be able to do that with you at another time also.
Well, thank you very much, Masood. Thank you very much. I know we started early, but at least we spared you getting up at 6, and we didn't know about the winter timing. So at least you got up slightly later. But thank you so much. We very much appreciate it. It's always a pleasure having you with us. I remember when you came to Lahore School of Economics in 2018 and how concerned you were exactly at the last point what you were saying about the debt and the financing gap, and you pointed it out then, and we realize it as we go along. But I hope that, now that you wear also your new hat, it gives you much more room to have a more open discussion, in a
Yes.
sense, when you in the IMF. And we hope, there are a number of areas where your Center for Global Development, for example, both on these questions of macro adjustments, and we look forward to reading what your center has come out, but also on the question of remittances, migration, where I had once indicated to you where we can continue to have
Right.
this dialogue. So thank you so much, Masood, for joining us, and thank you everybody for having come back again, and thank you, Ms. Hannah, for having coordinated, and thank you, Almazia, for having got everything right and given Mr. Masood an extra hour to sleep. So on these words, I will thank you all, and we look forward to having you again, sir. All the best.
Thank you, Masood. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.